Hello, and welcome to Remember the Film. I'm your host, Jeff Grizz Ulrich, and welcome to the podcast where we say, let us be thankful we have commerce. Buy more. Buy more now. Buy and be happy.
Buy stuff, buy stuff, buy stuff. Woo!
I was not informed of this, and I feel like this goes against my ideological leanings, so I'm not sure.
The lefty with the British accent is our friend Hugo Panay. How you doing this week, Hugo?
I'm doing good. I'm doing great.
And, of course, we're also always joined by Josh Bradley. How are you, Josh?
Pretty good, man. I just walked out of a white void, so I'm feeling chipper.
Feeling a lot, very chipper out of that white void. And we are joined today by our special guest, Will Beamon, who you may know from his time hosting Cantina Conversations, the best conversational Star Wars podcast in the galaxy. How are you, Will?
I'm good. I just love the way the universe works, where as soon as we start recording, my cat is knocking at the door. But I'm very excited to talk about something George Lucas made that's not Star Wars for once.
Right? I thought that would be a special occasion for you. But, Will, for anyone who hasn't heard you previously on your own podcast, tell us a little about yourself and your experience with film and television and whatnot.
Okay. Well, I used to host a Star Wars podcast called Cantina Conversations. I'm not sure if our episodes are still on the internet to be found or not. I canceled the server for those a long time ago, so I don't know if you can. But I went to school for film and TV production and media and cultural communication, so that's what my degree is in. And then I decided to take my professional life full circle and work for the university I went to and run their TV station for their public access channel. So
awesome.
I do all the programming for that to keep that up 24/7, and any productions that we film, I produce and direct all of that. So, and I can edit them sometimes, but I have student workers that I make my minions to film.
Minions, yeah.
But yeah,
that's
so
awesome, man.
Cool.
That's really cool. Yeah.
The life of public access television is a much different beast than like a traditional professional setting, because
So your life is 30 Rock.
What's that?
You're 30 Rock.
Yeah, because everything is basically reliant on the grant funding we get from the government. So as long as that happens, I'll be able to keep making stuff.
So Will, one of the reasons that I wanted to have Will on, and Hugo knows this as well, Will is another person who watches movies in much the same way that we do and talks about them in the same way we do, from like an artistic perspective and things like that. And he's also one of the few people I know who watches more movies than us. So
I've had a slow start, though. I haven't watched as many as I usually do, but now that I live with my fiance, I kind of have to split TV time compared to what I used to.
Yeah, that's a reality of my life too. Yeah.
Well, so in any case, this week we are talking about the George Lucas film THX 1138. That was his first directorial debut there. And so that's going to be our film to remember. But as always, we begin the show with talking about what we've been watching since our last show. So we'll go ahead. We'll start with Hugo. Hugo, what have you been watching recently?
Not much. I've spent the last 2 weeks, which is since we last recorded, just playing Elden Ring, the new From Software game, like a maniac. At every moment that I wasn't at university or at home studying or eating, I was basically playing this stupid game. And I finally finished it yesterday, so I'm going to go back to watching a bunch of movies now. But I did watch, because my girlfriend came to see me in the UK last weekend. We met up in London, and we went to see the giant IMAX screening for the Batman.
Wait, what's the movie you said?
Very, very small podcast.
I haven't heard of this movie. What movie is this?
The Batman. It's kind of this tiny, like, weird indie thriller with Robert Pattinson.
Wait, let me look it up. Keep talking. I'm going to look it up.
But interestingly enough, the other movie that I watched was a weird indie thriller with Robert Pattinson, and it was Good Time, the Safdie brothers movie. Yeah, I just watched that bit, like, on the train over to London, and then the
Did
day
you end up
after
robbing the train?
I did end up robbing the train, yes. It was very neon lit as well. It's very, very surprising. But yeah, both movies really good. The Batman, obviously everybody knows about this movie. Jokes aside, like it made a bunch of money first weekend, and I think it's going to keep making money. And I loved it. I really, really, really liked the Batman. I kind of haven't really stopped thinking about it since I watched it, and it's kind of been like I came out of it having some gripes with it, some problems, and then it's kind of been growing on me the more I think about it. And I think I'm going to go see it again next week if I can. It's kind of right up my alley. Like you guys know, like I love dark serial killer thrillers and that kind of stuff. And
Hugo loves to be sad. So a good emo movie like this. It's broody,
it's depressed. Like it just fits, man. And and this one also has the Batman in it. A great iteration of the Batman as well. I think it's great because it's going for more of a gritty tone, but while at the same time being extremely comic booky. So I appreciated it a lot for it.
I'm pretty sure when we talked about it beforehand, we've all seen the Batman. I'll just ask one quick question: is this your favorite Batman?
No.
Will's nodding his head yes. What do you think, Josh?
Favorite version of Batman or favorite Batman movie? Is that
favorite Batman movie? Yeah.
Yeah, that's the distinction.
I can't, after one viewing, compare this to The Dark Knight. I don't think.
Those are the front runners for me as well.
Yeah, but it's probably one or two, I imagine. Yeah, maybe three. But
I'm currently leaning towards yes. It is my favorite.
It might be. Yeah, it might be.
I think this is the first thought I had coming out of the movie, and it's what I wrote on Letterboxd. It's like I think this is the best Batman movie in sense of just embodying that character and Gotham as a place, and the sense of the sense of place that it gives and the character that it gives to the city itself. But I think my favorite movie that has the Batman in it is still The Dark Knight, if that makes any sense.
Because Heath Ledger's Joker elevates it so much for you.
That, and also there's something about some of the sequences in The Dark Knight and the action, and there's that sequence where he goes to Hong Kong and flies over, all shot in IMAX. It's just breathtaking.
The reason this is my favorite Batman movie is because this is the first time that we really see Batman as the detective he is portrayed as in the comics. I mean, his first appearance, and for the longest time, Batman's main storyline is in Detective Comics. So the fact that all the previous ones, there's sometimes that he's a little bit detective-y, but this one is like he's literally searching for clues and stuff at crime scenes and things. And so it's the first time that I really felt like we got the detective that I wanted him to be from the beginning. He's supposed to be the world's greatest detective. And, we get some of that from him. So I really like the Batman movie as well. What else? I guess we'll move on to Josh. Josh, what have you watched in the intervening time?
Real quick, before we do that, Hugo, Good Time is awesome. I'm really glad you watched it. And I don't know if this is a hot take, but I liked Good Time more than Uncut Gems, which was the much more financially successful Safdie Brothers movie that they followed it up with. Which I also really like. I just think Good Time is more for me, maybe. I don't know.
Maybe a good option for a future film to remember, since it is definitely...
If it's not on my list, it should be. So yeah, I'll add that to my possible films to remember list. This week, or I guess this is the last 2 weeks. We haven't recorded in 2 weeks, but 2 weeks ago, my in-laws were in town, and I watched LA Confidential with my father-in-law and my wife, and it was awesome, because LA Confidential is awesome.
It's a good movie.
Yeah, don't get sick of watching that one. It's just, it really sucks in. What's funny is I had seen this with my wife, 3 or 4 years ago, a long time ago, and I guess she had forgotten a lot of the details, and it is a pretty convoluted plot with a lot of twists and turns and reveals, and there's a reveal a little, probably 2/3 in the movie, where the name Rollo Tomasi becomes a major plot point, and when that happened in the movie, my wife gasped, even though she'd seen it before. She's like, oh my god, I have chills, and yeah, that's the power of movies, baby. Elsewhere, I guess in the last 2 weeks I've been rewatching some of the Best Picture nominees, because I am working on reviews for them. So I rewatched Don't Look Up, I rewatched Nightmare Alley, and I rewatched West Side Story 2021. my opinion on all three of those pretty much solidified on second viewing, which is Don't Look Up is Nat Morale is actually really good, and West Side Story is one of my favorite things I saw this year. And I also saw The Batman, which is good. We already talked about it, but good movie.
I'll go ahead and do mine, and then we'll finish up with Will's. What has he watched recently? In the last 2 weeks, I have also been doing some Oscar movie catch-up. I watched The Lost Daughter, and I'll be honest, like I enjoyed it okay while watching it, and then when I was looking at my diary of films on Letterboxd to make my list of what I've watched since our last show, I was like, oh yeah, I watched that. So like I think it's kind of forgettable, honestly, but I didn't hate it when I was watching it. I watched Sorry to Bother You, which is anything but forgettable. Very, very crazy movie that one is. And I enjoyed that a lot. I finally got to watch West Side Story when it came to streaming services. So thankfully, I finally checked that one off the list. Fantastic. I love the musical, and Spielberg certainly didn't screw it up. You know, it's really, really good.
I've thought of you all three times I've watched the movie during the Officer Krupke scene, G. Officer Krupke, which is so fun. The staging that is so good in this new one.
Yep, I played him once, which is I'm sure why Josh was referencing that.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
And then I watched Drive My Car, which, if you haven't watched that, and that's probably the one that's most people out there are going to be least likely to have watched before the Oscars occur. Don't sleep on that. Drive My Car is excellent. It's lengthy, for sure. I mean, it's the exact same length as The Batman, which I also thought was quite long.
Yes.
But Drive My Car is excellent. I can't stress enough how much you should go see that movie.
And it's on HBO Max right now.
It is currently on HBO Max, yeah.
Oh,
but
it's also great.
It's also a 3-hour Japanese movie about grief. So
yeah,
know that going in.
Hugo, have you not seen it yet, Hugo?
Yeah, no, I've been meaning to watch this one, but
this is a Hugo movie.
It just wasn't available, so I'll do it. I'll do it for sure. Thank you, Willie, again for your password.
It's also very much like about bilingual people, Hugo. So you'll find a lot to.
And that's one of the things I thought was most fascinating about it was the use of language. And like, yes, it's a Japanese movie, but it's also a Korean language.
There's Korean, there's Mandarin, there's English, there's sign language. Yeah,
it's really cool. And then I watched The Batman, which we talked about. I watched Summer of Soul, which is nominated for Best Documentary. I forget how much I love some of the bands that played in the Summer of Soul. So it was really cool to see that, and also really cool to see like the context of the world events and how different groups of people related to different things that were happening at the same time. So that's definitely worth a watch. And the worst thing I've watched in the intervening weeks was Impractical Jokers, the movie. I've been watching the show because I do love the show, and I was like, well, I guess I'll finish it out with watching the movie. It's bad.
Yeah, that makes sense. Hey, real quick, I forgot one for me. This wasn't a movie, so that's why I didn't put it on my list, but I've watched 9 episodes of the show Yellow Jackets in the last 3 days, the Showtime show that aired in November, December, and January. And wow, there's a reason I've watched 9 episodes in 3 days. My wife, who can't sit for a movie longer than an hour 45 minutes, watched 4 hours of Yellow Jackets in a single day, including 3 hours in one sitting. So if that's not a ringing endorsement, I don't know what is. Yeah. If you have Showtime, holy crap, Yellow Jackets is so good. In fact, like, I'm eager to get off this podcast so I can go watch the finale. So I'm not going to be rushing off or anything, but just know that's where my head's at right now.
Well, okay. So the last and certainly not least, Will, what have you been watching recently?
Well, I forgot that you guys didn't record an episode last week, so I got to go back 2 weeks and see what I've been watching. Well, for the quest that is never ending, we watched Watchmen and Iron Man 2.
That's a combo.
Iron Man. Well, we didn't watch them back to back. This is just over the course of 2 weeks, but
that's good.
Iron Man 2 has aged significantly worse than I thought it was going to. Like, I remember not liking it that much, but like it was kind of a slog to get through. So it was a little disappointing because I do like Jon Favreau and his directing style. It's just weird to watch something of his that I don't enjoy.
Yeah. I like Sam Rockwell and Mickey Rourke too, but like I remember nothing from that movie, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, like when I was rewatching it, I was like, I don't really remember where this plot goes.
The only thing I remember from that is that Tony Stark is dying because like the substance of the reactor is killing him or something.
Yeah, something like that. I already forget the plot, and I just watched it like a week ago.
What it was, they were trying to adapt parts of Iron Man's most famous story arc, The Demon in the Bottle. This is where Tony Stark is battling his alcoholism. But because this is a movie for children, they couldn't do alcoholism. So they gave him metal poisoning that makes him act drunk.
Oh, okay.
Sure.
But
and they made him addicted to being Iron Man.
Which, speaking of a better movie, which version of Watchmen did you guys watch?
We watched the director's cut.
Okay.
I'm sorry, did you tell us what the quest was?
Oh, yeah, the quest is something me and two of my friends have been doing since, I think, the fall of 2019, where we've been watching every single live-action comic book movie that was theatrically released, with some exceptions. But yeah, so we started with like the 1951 Superman movie, and we're now into 2010. So we've made some pretty good progress. But we've been going like in chronological order, but like when the Snyder Cut came out, we bumped up the whole DC universe, and we watched all those. Before No Way Home came out, we bumped up all the Spider-Mans. Before the Batman, we decided just to bump up. Or no, I don't think we bumped any of them up because we decided Dark Knight Rises wasn't worth rewatching before seeing the Batman.
Way harsh time.
So sometimes like that we'll adjust the order, but for the most part we're just doing chronological order. Like this coming week, we're watching Jonah Hex, which is something I don't think any of us have seen. Jackson didn't even know it existed.
Wow, really?
Yeah, me neither.
I knew it existed, but I haven't seen it.
I guess the young people have forgotten about Jonah Hex.
But yeah, so we did that for the quest, and then every Sunday night we go to a friend of mine's house and have a movie night there, and we've been watching the Oceans franchise.
Oh,
so we watched Oceans 12 and 13, and then tonight, while we're recording it, we're going over to finish it and watch Oceans 8, which I haven't seen yet.
I've not seen that either.
But I heard it was fine, so I guess we'll see how it is.
If you enjoy the Oceans movies, it is fine.
My hell yes was mostly precipitated by Oceans 11 and 12, which are just 12 also. They're just so good.
One of the best trilogies, I would say.
I can't even speak for 13 because it's been years since I've seen 13, but holy crap, 11 and 12 are just unassailable.
Yeah. And then I watched Turning Red.
I'm very jealous because I love animated movies, and so I'm going to watch that probably tomorrow night. But I unfortunately not have watching
it. The discourse around that movie though has been very interesting and almost problematic in a way to me, because so many people have described that movie as quote unquote horny. And it's really not. Like, I think maybe that's a hashtag nerds please go outside challenge, because like it's no different than any other kid's cartoon in the last decade. Like I don't get how that's people's takeaway.
I haven't seen it, but it's about a girl like becoming a woman, right? That's kind of like the whole metaphor.
I mean, it takes place with a preteen girl as the lead character who is just obsessed with a boy band. And, I mean, I've seen Harry Styles in concert, and they very accurately capture what that concert-going experience was like. I don't know. Just to me, I think that's a very strange takeaway that people are having with that movie.
There is a cocktail of emotions that explains, I think, teen girl fandom, particularly of boy bands, and like horniness is an aspect of that cocktail. I think. I don't know if that's the case for everybody, but like that's like a girl discovering herself.
But I would be surprised if that was the main takeaway.
I got you.
It'll be interesting to revisit that conversation once you guys have seen it.
Okay, I haven't seen it, so I'm talking out of my ass. Yeah.
To me, after seeing it, I think that's a really weird takeaway people are having from that movie. But
I'm watching it. I'm watching it tonight, just after the podcast with Julia. So
that would not be the first movie of the past, year or so that had a weird response, and especially in terms of the sexual politics of the movie, which we don't have to get into. But like that would be the first time that happened, especially not recently.
But yeah, that wraps up everything I've watched.
Very cool. So that brings us now to our film to remember, THX 1138. Now, my first question actually is it THX 1138 or 1138 or what? How do you guys? How's
also his his roommate wife calls him THX, doesn't she?
She says
something
like
that.
THX, basically.
Yeah.
Text,
Yeah.
Will, you'll know this. What do they say in A New Hope? Do they say cell 1138 or do they say cell 1138? Because I think that's the answer.
I think it is 1138.
I think it's
and that's the way
1138.
I've always said it too.
There you go.
Well, that's the definitive answer. THX
But in the movie,
1138.
they say 1138 a couple times.
Yeah. Well,
Oh, damn.
they also said Princess
had it.
Leia a few times in A New Hope. So,
That's true.
so this movie, as you can tell if you're watching live, is directed by George Lucas. And you can tell that by watching live because Will is wearing George Lucas's face plastered all over his shirt.
Fantastic shirt. Yes.
Yep, it's everywhere. I'm covered in Lucas today. Not like on top of like the tattoos of his work too.
Yes. The movie was released March 11th, 1971, directed by George Lucas and written by George Lucas and Walter Murch. The film was adapted from Lucas's short film that he did as a film student at USC called Electronic Labyrinth, THX 1138 4EB. So I'm glad he simplified the title.
Which is the name of Elon Musk's second son, who's I'm sorry.
That's good, though. But this movie was executive produced by Francis Ford Coppola. It was the second American zoetrope movie. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Yes. I think so.
When Coppola bought Lucas's edit of the film to show to the execs at Warner Brothers, they were unsatisfied with it, and they re-edited some parts and cut about 4 minutes in-house. This, of course, upset George Lucas, and was one of the key reasons going forward that George Lucas wanted to have, final cut on all of his movies. Anything to add on that? Will, you're the Lucas expert.
No, I mean, I can't remember. I'm pretty sure it is this movie, though, that bankrupts American Zoetrope. Because it was not really that financially successful. I can't remember exactly because I forgot to Google it beforehand to refresh my mind. But I think it is this film that bankrupts that studio that Coppola tried to do.
Well, don't they go on to produce like The Godfather and like all his
like
70s stuff?
he movies he does, he keeps the name with him, but like his original pitch for American Zoetrope was supposed to be what Lucasfilm became, basically, where it was supposed to be a major independent film Hollywood studio, and then he's just kind of kept the name for himself over the years, which would make sense. But
looking at the movies they've made, that does make sense. That's basically like after after the 70s, they basically do Coppola movies and I think like experimental stuff from filmmakers that Coppola likes, i.e. Kurosawa and Jean-Luc Godard and Paul Schrader, etc. That makes sense.
yeah.
And this also makes sense given that the budget was $777,000 and to a gross of $2,437,000 in the U.S. and Canada, which was the only place it was released theatrically. That's really that seems pretty high to me, But I'm also wondering about we always talk about this, what the marketing budget was on this, because it's a sci-fi film in the 70s. Sci-fi films were a lot more mainstream in the 70s than they are, especially the more artsy ones with things like 2001, A Space Odyssey.
They were a lot
like
bleaker, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Certainly
2001 was
bleaker.
kind of a huge event thing before the event thing was a thing,
Yeah.
but it's still kind of a niche. The fact that this movie made 2 million, with inflation, I'm sure it's not even that small a number, but it's probably just not what studios wanted at the time, and the fact that it was this independent studio that was trying to sort of establish itself, I can understand how that number could be a problem.
I also read that this movie ended up making over $900,000 in rentals, which I thought was an interesting factoid because this movie is sort of a cult classic, and that cult being the cult of George Lucas.
Yeah, I wonder. I wonder if there could be any way to quantify how many people have seen this movie just post Star Wars, like how many people have
I'm
gone
sure.
back and rediscovered.
I'm sure way more than saw it in theaters. Honestly.
Oh yeah, for sure.
I still think this movie, though, because like as we'll talk about it, is still very much like something that really only big Lucas fans will watch and enjoy.
Yeah.
Like it's still not that approachable, and it's still a really weird movie. Because like it re-released in theaters after Star Wars came out, and again after the director's cut came out, and like still made no money. So it's still a movie that people aren't flocking to see, even though it had his name to it.
Yeah.
Well, and so when we talk about that gross, $2 million, that's including the re-releases, right?
Maybe.
Oh, I don't.
There's only been one
I haven't
re-release,
looked up the
as far as I
Wikipedia
know.
article on it. I don't know how their metric is on it, but I can't. I also didn't have time to go through and look at all his works either. But I think this might only be the second Warner Brothers production that he's made.
Well, but so that's what I have for the boilerplate section on the movie. So we're going to go ahead and get into talking about what the movie's actually about, which is a complicated thing to discuss. So I'll give the basic premise. In the distant future, the world is a hyper-controlled society where everyone conforms to the rules set forth by the state, and everyone complies without question, for the most part. This is done through mandatory sedative drugs that everyone takes that makes them docile. Human relationships are extremely regimented, down to having a roommate assigned to you, and things like sexual relationships are strictly forbidden. THX 1138, played by Robert Duvall, is no exception and works away, essentially following programming until his roommate, LUH 3417, swaps
Roommate/wife, kind of.
Roommate/wife.
Yeah.
A little unclear to me on that.
Completely. The fact they're called roommates is indicative of what kind of relationship you have with your spouse, quote unquote. Two people that live next to each other.
But she swaps his drugs and essentially breaks him out of his programming because they have actually fallen in love with each other. I have questions on that, which we will discuss later. She is quickly imprisoned, and THX is arrested shortly thereafter, but is now willing to do whatever it takes to escape and find La to run away with her. So that's the setup of the movie, and that's basically the first act of the film. So first question that we kind of always ask is for our general thoughts on the movie. What did you think? Did you like it? Hugo, you go first.
I like this movie. It's the second time I see it, and I think it's really interesting. I think some things about it are so good. I think the way it looks, first of all, I think still stands up today. I really like the aseptic look. I really like the design, even though it's pretty simple, but I think very effective. I also, obviously there's not much in terms of plot. Like the story feels a little thin for like a full feature length film. Like to the point where because I also saw the short, and I think the short is almost kind of already gives you enough of what this movie is going to be. And I almost think like if they expanded it in like a 30-minute short, it could have been something really special. And maybe going the full 90 minutes sometimes makes it drag a little bit. But overall, I really like it. Just because it's going for some themes that I appreciate. I always love a dystopian story, so this one works.
The original short is 15 minutes, right, Hugo?
The original short is like 14 minutes and a half or something, yeah. Okay. But it's like the way it's done is like it's basically, as you said, you've mentioned something about this off mic, I think, Josh, but it's basically a montage. The original show is like a bit of it is kind of almost like if it was animation. Then you see people running, but there's very little dialogue. A lot of the dialogue is these disembodied voices, and I think it kind of gives you the best parts of what the movie is eventually going to be. But that being said, I really enjoyed the movie also.
And I'll just give my thoughts on it real quick. I also enjoyed the movie. It's definitely not going to be for everyone. And it approaches the point for me where it's getting to the point where it's almost too philosophical, which is an issue for me. But I guess that's also kind of the point. So that's why I think, it didn't cross the line to me where it became preachy. So I was able to appreciate the messaging of the movie without feeling like it was being force-fed to me. And as Hugo said, it's really cool to look at. The visuals are striking, and some of the shots are quite beautiful, and the practical effects, as we'll talk about later, are really excellent, and not too surprising when you see what George Lucas does in the future with that sort of stuff. Josh, I've seen your rating on Letterboxd for the movie, so I'm kind of saving you for last. So I'm going to ask Will next. Will, what are your general thoughts on the movie?
I mean, I like it because I like this kind of sci-fi. Now, granted, despite being the George Lucas lover I am, I didn't see this movie until I was an adult. So I've only seen the director's cut. So I don't... And I'll talk about that more later because there's some points throughout this movie that I can't tell if it's stuff that he's used since the early 70s or if it's stuff he changed in 2004 to sound familiar. Because the sound design of this movie and the short film specifically are, like, incredible.
Yeah.
Like, that's one thing he's always honed on in his career is sound design, so it makes sense. But, like, when you watch the original short to know that he was just a college student, it's no wonder it had so much accolades to it because it's incredibly artistically shot. And this movie, I think, is the better culmination of his college work, that the kind of career he could have had until Star Wars. Because if you watch all of his other stuff, I have it written down here, like, out of his college works, except for 1 minute 42:08, which is just a short film about a car racing on a track and clocking that lap time, and then his other film, The Emperor, which is about like a fake radio DJ, but like in the height of radio DJs being like a celebrity. Like, outside of those two, everything that he made while in college fits the mold of this film better. Everything is like a tone poem, and it's super interestingly, artistically shot. And you see that throughout this film, too. He has, like,
And
very
bleak
artistic
as well.
framing with his shot design.
And
Because that, like, my biggest complaint of his directing skills with the Star Wars movies is when it came to blockbuster filmmaking, he's an incredibly static director. There really are not any, like, interesting camera angles. He is very much, here's the frame, I'm going to let the actors act within that frame. Whereas before Star Wars, that really wasn't his style. So it's almost like he changed his directing style to fit how he wanted that to work, and then it just carried over. The prequels, he got a little bit better at having some motion in his frames, but that's because he was so invested in directing that digital world that he built. And that carries over a lot to the visual aesthetic of the Clone Wars series, too. But, like, the way he just frames shots in the original Star Wars, and most of the prequels still as well, is just a very statically shot, just letting the actors carry the scenes, which is part of the reason why the prequels don't work as well, because Hayden Christensen is stiff as a board. So when you're relying on him to carry a scene, he really can't. So, like, it's refreshing from a production standpoint to always watch this movie and just be like, wow, what a great artistic view of how to shoot this scene. I wish we could get that for the next 50 years of his career, and we really don't.
So do you think that this is more of a dynamic camera than Star Wars? Because I feel like he doesn't move the camera much in this, does he?
Well, it's not that he moves the camera as much, but more so how he sets his shots up. Sometimes, like, peeking through the openings of some debris, or the way that it's cropped on the countdown timer, or focusing on the buttons of the director's board in the control room while dialogue for the scene is happening. I think that's it's kind of like why Soderbergh is so good to me. Is like he has a really interesting way of visually showing a scene.
It's even his lighting in this one is much more obvious, like, than in Star Wars. Like, ascending up an escalator with, just bright white light, or, opening a door and then getting hit with bright light. It's much more interesting than a lot of the shots that you get in Star Wars, which, as Will has, alluded to, is just very much about what is happening on the screen and less about a metaphor that he's trying to portray.
And
Hugo?
and it also, like, you mentioned that the camera doesn't move, and that's kind of true. Like, he does still like this idea of having a frame and then something happening within that frame that tells the story. But when the camera does move, it moves in a way that is interesting. Like, you know how in the prequels sometimes the camera is moving, but it's moving so slowly just to follow the characters who are walking, and it's like, that's just, yeah, the camera is moving technically, but it doesn't really matter. In this one, like, there's that moment when, you know, either the camera is very close on the character and then it moves up and it reveals that there's thousands of people walking, or
Right.
there's the sequence at the end with the car chase where the camera zooms past and follows the car. Like, when the camera does move, it does so for a reason, and it feels interesting. There's also that frame when Robert Duvall is running, and you see him from behind all that circuitry, and the camera follows him. That's another sequence of movement that kind of worked for me. I think the imagery of this is the strongest part, which is ironic because, as you say, Will, it kind of, the imagery of, you know, how he frames things and how sometimes they're so static and boring is one of the major criticisms of most of his work. Which I find, which is fascinating looking at this because it's the complete opposite.
Okay, so I kind of buried the lead a little bit earlier, but Josh, what are your thoughts on the movie? What did you think of it? Did you like it?
So a lot of times when you're watching movies made before a certain time, you kind of have to acknowledge that audiences in 1971 would see this differently than I will see it, just because I have the benefit of 50 years of movies being made in the wake of this. So that's a long way to say I didn't like it very much, but I guess I can appreciate why other people might like it. I read Roger Ebert's review, a contemporaneous review, so the review he wrote in 71, and it's very short. It's like 5 paragraphs, and it basically boils down to 2 paragraphs are plot summary, so it's really 3 paragraphs of analysis, and it's mostly just, Ebert gave it 3 out of 4 stars, but his take was, there's not really a story, but the sound design's cool. That's basically what that's Roger Ebert's review. 3 stars. Which, yeah, I mean, I agree with that. The sound design is cool. In fact, Walter Murch, who has a screenplay credit on this, is also credited with sound montages in the opening credits, which basically just means he was a sound editor. So the fact that the sound editor has a co-writing credit, I don't know. I'm assuming he worked on the screenplay too, but that's, I think, telling of like the construction of the movie, basically, because I think he like added in all like the off-screen voiceovers that we hear, like the workers, which is most of the dialogue you hear in the movie is that. So if that might be his screenplay contribution right there, but I don't know. There wasn't a lot for me to like narratively grasp onto, which is kind of what I need. And beyond that, like the visuals are very cool and the sound design is really cool, and I don't want to like take that away from the movie, but I think in 2022 it's hard to have that be like the reason that I'm really liking the movie, I guess.
Yeah.
At least a movie like this that, I kind of have seen stuff like this before and seen stories like this before. I actually wanted to ask you guys what like dystopian movies or stories it remind you of. Orwell's the obvious example. Anything else though?
Did you guys see that movie Equilibrium? That came out in the early 2000s.
Yeah, I never saw that.
It's really bad. It's not good. But the premise for that, like the very basic premise for that, is basically exactly the same. The difference being that one also is about like doing kung fu with guns and Matrix style action. So it like really, that movie unravels, but the premise is very similar to that. But yeah, like it's definitely not reinventing the wheel in terms of, there's been literature before this, Brave New World, Fahrenheit 451.
That was what I was about to say as my example. I think of Fahrenheit 451 with this one.
But, I think there's something to be said about Lucas kind of taking sort of story structures, story types, and recreating his own original ideas with them, but maintaining that kind of thing. I don't know if...
Well, a couple things. I want to comment on that, but before that, I want to say that this for me, my point of reference for a world like this is The Giver, which is the Lois Lowry novel
That was
that
another one I
everybody,
thought of.
every U.S. kid read in the 90s. I'm pretty sure it was an
Yeah.
enormously successful book in the 90s. But like watching this, I immediately just like, oh, this is like The Giver, which might be pulling my own card a little bit. I'm not sure like the literary merits of that book, but at least, you know, I loved it when I was a kid and stuff. And like I watched this, and people take pills to suppress their emotions and dress in all white and that kind of stuff, and have no individual expression. Like for me, my point of reference to that is The Giver. And which is the other thing I want to say is that, like, you know, I read The Giver when I was like 12. And so like it's a pretty mind-blowing book for a 12-year-old, probably way less so for adults, I imagine. But Hugo, you mentioned like Lucas taking stories that, you know, aren't really reinventing the wheel, just putting a spin on it. This strikes me as a, not to be unkind, this strikes me as a very like college kid movie premise. And the fact that he made this in college, you know, made this shortly after college based on a short he did make in college is not remotely surprising. And like, to pull my own card a little bit here, like, you know, I've been writing screenplays in my free time for several years now, and one of my first ones was in this world also. When I was like 23, I had an idea like, oh, what if you're in this dystopian society where you have no individual expression, everyone dresses in white and has no hair, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, yeah, I'm not surprised that Lucas also made a movie when he was 23 with that same idea, because I was in that same boat. Like, that's like where my mind went. So, I don't know, and I don't know, maybe because, you know, the story is pretty thin, that I can say that this movie is kind of half-baked and just kind of like he has an idea for a world and then nothing to fill it with, which makes sense that it's based on a 15-minute short and that kind of stuff. But I don't know. This wasn't really for me, I think, is the grand conclusion there.
And that's fair. But one of the reasons that we wanted to watch this movie is because, you know, for all of us are Star Wars fans. And George Lucas, you know, means a lot to a lot of us. So I think one of the reasons that I wanted to watch this was to see kind of what led him to what he does in Star Wars. So next thing I wanted to ask was just a little bit about our experience with George Lucas. I know Will is, you know, he lives and breathes George Lucas's career. So
And somehow I'm still engaged.
So my first question was like, is he really just Star Wars to you guys? Like for me, I've seen American Graffiti and I've seen THX, but still, like, when I think of George Lucas, I you know, those are afterthoughts entirely. He's basically purely Star Wars for me. Do you have a similar mindset, or do you think that now that if you've seen a couple of his other works, are you opened up to more of his, you know, wider capabilities?
I guess, like, I know Will will have more to say about this, but like a few years back, I kind of got the bug of interest and I watched everything he'd made, basically. And, you know, I haven't watched everything he's produced, but I have watched some of the things that he was involved as a producer as well. And I kind of looked into like his history with the way that he was kind of a pioneer in a lot of film technology, you know, both live action, CGI, animation, and a lot of that stuff. And I think I kind of almost associate him more with, I mean, obviously Star Wars is Star Wars, but like I kind of associate him personally more with this idea of trying to be on the cutting edge of technology, sometimes for better or for worse, because it doesn't, like, sometimes he did things before it was, you know, they were ready to be on film and they didn't completely work. But I think I always appreciated that side of him, outside of just being a massive Star Wars fan. And also, like, Indiana Jones, for example, is something that I associate as much with Lucas as I do with Spielberg.
Yeah.
Down to, you know, CGI gophers in Kingdom of the Crystal Skull. Like, that's a very George Lucas type thing. But I really like that movie as well. Like, I kind of find it endearing. Also, like, I was 9 years old when Revenge of the Sith came out, and I watched that in theaters. So I was like, to me, that movie is always going to be great, even though, you know, it has a lot of problems. I'm very positive on George Lucas, despite other people not being so high on him, I guess.
Josh, Will, any thoughts?
I'll go ahead, Will.
Oh, I was going to let you go because I'll probably end up talking too much about it.
Okay, then I'll be quick because I'm brief. I think this might be the only non-Star Wars movie of his I've seen, I think, because I haven't seen American Graffiti.
Oh,
and,
you would like American Graffiti.
You would.
Yeah, I think I would. And
yeah.
I think that's more up my alley than this, based on what I know about that movie. And your question was, is he more than Star Wars? For me, no, just because this is the first movie of his I've seen. And also, like, I don't think he is for most people. I think he's mostly just Star Wars, which I mean he's doing fine. You know, like he's you know got paid $4 billion by Disney, which honestly in hindsight was probably they got a discount. Honestly, like, but I remember at the Force Awakens premiere on the red carpet, he was being interviewed, and someone asked him like, you know, oh, it's like, well, you know, what are you up to now that you sold Star Wars and Disney's in control? And he was like, oh, you know, I'm making my own films and that kind of stuff. And I'm like, that made me kind of sad that, like, you know, he is still a filmmaker, you know, even though he's only made a small handful of feature films, and like, you know, kind of no one gives a shit. I think most people kind of only care about him for the Star Wars he created, which, you know, I mean, again, he doesn't need my sympathy. He's doing fine, but like you know, I kind of wish what kind of
you sympathize with him from an artistic perspective.
Yeah, and a thing you have on the outline here is what kind of career would he have had if he hadn't made Star Wars?
Yes.
And I mean, the thing is maybe there's a distinct possibility he wouldn't really have had a career, but the other possibility is, you know, he was best buds with Frank Coppola and Steven Spielberg, and I think Brian De Palma too. So like, he probably would have had,
Scorsese.
yeah, and Scorsese. So like, he would have done something, just, you know, would have looked a little different, I guess. So I mean, I'm curious about that. I'm glad we have Star Wars. I probably prefer to have Star Wars than not have Star Wars, but you know, it is something to think about.
An interesting part about that is that if you look at like old footage of those directors at that time, like pre-Star Wars era, a lot of them all say, oh, Lucas is the most talented of all of us. Like, they always talk about him, oh, he's such a genius, he's so good at editing, he's like, he has so many cool ideas, and he kind of became the big corporate entity that he was so annoyed by in the early parts of his career. And I do wish that he would have, you know, kind of made more movies. Like, he kind of fell into the background. Like, when I was saying he started innovations and stuff, like, Lucasfilm was involved in initiating Pixar, for example. They were the first to shoot movies on digital. They were the first to do a fully CGI character. Like, he kind of fell into the background, but in the background, he was kind of an innovator for the home film industry.
The impact.
In ways that we don't even acknowledge. Like, we talk about Star Wars, and obviously Star Wars kind of spawned an era of filmmaking that we're still in some ways, but it's not just that. And I do wish he could have worked on more movies, and I wish that, you know, I don't know if he will, but I'd love to see something that he would make now.
The impact that he, you know, has had on the industry is undeniable. Just between, I mean, just think about how many movies you saw, you know, growing up with where the movie opens with THX logo and that wah sound effect. Yeah. You know, like, it's
also,
undeniable.
Like, how many, like, to this day, how many movies have ILM special effects?
That was the other thing. The special effects through ILM, like, you might, I don't know, at least 50% of my favorite movies probably have ILM special effects done in them, right? I mean, the impact of George Lucas and what he spawned is undeniable, but I do question, like, you know, what if he had done Star Wars and then done one for him? Like, do the one for them, one for me that so many directors do. What if we had gotten that from him? What kind of crazy, unique movies like THX would we have gotten from him if he had not gone whole hog into creating the Star Wars empire? But Will, what did you have to say on the topic?
Well, I guess I don't need to go too much further into like the technology that he's behind, because but also the guts that he had as a filmmaker that was coming off of, at the time of Star Wars release, only one successful film, and that was American Graffiti, to where the sound design of Star Wars mattered so much that when he sent that to theaters, he said, you need to upgrade your sound systems to play this the way I want it, or it's not going to sound good and people aren't going to like this movie. And then they listened. So like the THX technology, ILM, Pixar, all of that kind of stuff is cool. And with the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles, he was pioneering ways of using rear projection back then in the early 90s that was basically the predecessor for the LED screen technology that they use in the Volume for The Mandalorian, and they used in the Batman, and they used in Solo. So like, he was doing stuff like that with regular old-fashioned rear projection and not fancy LED screens like we have now too. So like, in a way, that's one of the, from a production side, why I like The Mandalorian so much, because it is very much Lucas-y and using the new technology to push things forward, because the volume is going to be used in everything now. Like that even independent filmmakers have access to that, because there's software of volume technology that's open source that anyone can download, and you just have to make sure to have the screen to use it. So even for independent filmmakers that are making a movie off $5,000, they'll have the capability, if they want to make their backdrops of scenes look much grander in scope than they would doing something just in a diner or something like that. But I do kind of wish, because there's a quote in his documentary Filmmaker that he makes about Francis Ford Coppola, who, when he's directing The Rain People, and there's a scene in there, and it's interesting too, because this is a documentary thing that he made, but also shot very artistically, like THX and his college films, where like some of the shots are just, he's got the camera in like a corner behind a potted plant, and he's just filming the actors talking, which is interesting. But there's literally a quote in a moment of that when I heard it the first time, the irony on it, because Francis Ford Coppola says, the world is filled with guys who said, well, I'm going to make the money and then I'll make personal films. And somehow they never get around to doing that. And this is in a documentary starring George Lucas, who said he was always going to make personal films, made his big movie, and then never got around to doing that.
Like, it's kind of what Coppola did, though, because like he did make the giant movies, but at the same time he also made One from the Heart, which, I mean, obviously was a financial disaster, but he still kind of got to make all those weird movies that he wanted to do for himself that nobody likes, but it doesn't matter because he loves those.
Right. And like even the new movie that he's making now, that he's financing himself,
Megalopolis,
100%.
Yeah.
Like, he's like, I don't care if anyone likes it. He's like, I'm using my own money on it. So,
yeah.
But like, I kind of wish I lived in the reality where Star Wars did bomb, and then we end up getting what George Lucas's Apocalypse Now was going to be, because that was his next film. It was supposed to be Apocalypse Now, and he even went as far as started location scouting and casting, like pooling together a cast of who he wanted. And then when he was like, well, I got to do Star Wars now, Coppola took it. So like, I want to live in the world where we got his Vietnam film, because George Lucas is obsessed with that war in particular, and like the political aspects he would take, and he kind of got to make his own movies too, in a way. Like, he's very much the co-creator and co-everything story-wise of Indiana Jones, and he produced Howard the Duck, he produced Willow, but he didn't direct those, because he just wanted to be able to have his control over it, which he can do as a producer. And like, he told the story of Red Tails because that was a story that he cared about from a history perspective. So he did kind of, in a way, get to do that. But I think as the years went on, he became very sensitive to feedback. I think eventually just people got to him, and that was part of what really crushed his filmmaking ambitions, because there's even an interview after the prequels where somebody asked if he would ever make another movie again, and he was like, why would I just made them and people hated them. And you think about it and you're like, he's got a point. I mean, there are people that made a full-fledged documentary about how much they hate the prequel trilogy, like directed to George Lucas, that they allegedly love so much. So I can understand why.
The worst part is that it's not just dislike of the movies, but it's the personal attacks that he got. Like,
yeah, so I think that's kind of what killed his ambition from being able to do that. Except now the caveat is, I think he is going to go back to making these experimental weird films, but the only way you're ever going to be able to watch them is go to his museum. Honestly, I think he will make these weird experimental films, and they'll play in his museum, and you can either go that month and watch it, or it'll be gone forever.
Well, let's dive into some specifics about THX, and we'll kind of move through some of this stuff a little quickly, but I just want to get some thoughts on some of the performances. Robert Duvall as THX. What do you guys think about Robert Duvall in this movie. I mean, Robert Duvall's a very well known actor, and had some very, very important roles in his career, and this would probably not be listed among them. But what did you think of Robert Duvall in this movie? We can start with Josh.
I liked when he was in the white void and was kind of like doing like contortions and like wriggling around. That was fun. Other than that, I don't know. He's playing like an unemotive, like, medically, emotionally suppressed character. So, not a lot to latch onto.
Yeah.
At first,
so
I was
he
like,
nailed it.
yeah. I mean, yeah, that's true. At first, I was thinking, is this the earliest I've seen Robert Duvall? No, he's Boo Radley. So no, it's not.
So no.
But it does predate The Godfather, though. But yeah, I mean, he's good in this. He serves the character function, I guess. But there's not a lot to the character to function.
That's kind of how I felt about it. And I'll just to summarize all the actors, they did. I think they all did what they were asked to do. Mm-hmm. And
I like Donald Pleasance. Donald Pleasance is the MVP here.
Yeah,
I think.
But for the most part, they're all playing flat characters with very little emotion, which
and that's the point, though.
Which is kind of the point. And so, like but like as Josh said, not a lot to latch onto. So it's hard for me to say that any of the performances were standout because they were supposed to be the same. So hard to be standout if you're all the same.
Like Donald Pleasance, for me, he was the most emotive. He was kind of the quirkiest character, but I do not understand his role in the story. To be honest, like I didn't get why. Like I get, like at the beginning, I thought it was very interesting where he was like a hacker who modifies the system's programs, and that's a crime in this world, and so he will be reported. And I almost feel like if he disappeared after that, he would have served his purpose in the story. But then he's kind of kept around, and he keeps showing up, and I didn't.
So
I know why.
I have two things to say on Donald Pleasance. One is that I think that his purpose in the movie is to show you more of the metaphors that Lucas wants to get into.
You could have had Duvall, for example, run into
I agree.
that Jesus.
But that's what they used him for. But the other thing I want to say was my favorite review I saw in Letterboxd for this movie. It was one line. It says, "How far would you go to avoid being Donald Pleasance's roommate?" Which, he was creepy. He was very creepy.
That's true.
But and then La, played by Maggie McOlmy, I honestly, I was disappointed with her performance because she's supposed to be the one who's not medicated, right? So why isn't she a little more emotive? Now I know she has to hide some of her emotions in order to not get caught. But, once she's caught, like, why isn't it more, like, why doesn't she become more human faster? Does that make sense? What did you guys think about her in this movie?
She's barely in it.
Yeah.
She that's the other thing is, like, it's kind of like the whole like, first half of the movie is about these two, and then she kind of disappears in the back half. And I guess, there's a payoff to that, I guess, but I don't know.
She's kind of a
she should have been this
MacGuffin.
more. Yeah.
Which is, a
definitely.
little upsetting.
Yeah, she's very much there just to carry the plot through. But I think it's the story being as bare bones as it is that, like, she does become more human, but, like, she doesn't have much to work with. So, like, the humanity she shows is, like, the most she's going to be able to get out of this.
Yeah. And it's so, like I guess the movie is kind of going for such a bleak tone that we don't get to see, like, a moment of them, maybe just being happy. Like, they're instantly, as soon as they're liberated from these pills, they're instantly desperate because they know they'll get caught. And, like, the first 15 minutes of the movie has more story than the rest of it, almost. So things just happen.
I see, Hugo, you have in the notes here, the other standout performance you have. You want to share that with us?
Oh yes, I wrote a note about the sort of the disembodied voices and the nameless characters who are, like, always talking in the background. That's the element that is most similar to the short, and I really like that. I think it really creates this mood of just, like, it's almost like this system that is automated and it's being operated by people, but they're just doing so in a completely mechanical way. And I think it's a great idea that the movie doesn't have like a big reveal that explains what the system is, who's in control, how it's actually works. I like that we don't find out. Like, I think it makes it that much more effective. It almost feels like it's so far into a dystopian future that almost maybe there aren't even people at the top anymore. It's like completely automated, just kind of works by itself. And I think that's a clever way of doing that. Because a lot of dystopian movies will have like the big reveal. Like, I think of Snowpiercer, for example. You'll have the big reveal at the end where you meet the architect that is controlling this whole thing, and this one doesn't, and I find that interesting.
These disembodied voices and nameless characters that we see throughout this are, like you said, their purpose is to set up the universe, and that I think that's a really well done aspect of the movie. Yeah. But they are essentially props. Right.
Yeah.
So it's weird that it's very like artistic, I guess, to have a movie where none of the characters are that much of characters. They're all just to facilitate the narrative like thread without actually having a narrative.
There's also not much narrative. Yeah, exactly. So like it's hard to latch on to anything for me watching this.
And so because of that, the themes are the most important part of this movie,
yes.
I think. And so that's what we're going to go into now. Just because I've been letting us run long, I'm going to kind of breeze through some of these. But the main thing, the obvious one that we've already touched on a little bit, is the dystopian future theme. As Josh has already said, this is not something that's new about this movie. It kind of sets it in a genre, which there are some sub-themes that I think are part of this, including the forced conformity, everyone having to take their sedatives and all that stuff, surveillance state.
We live in a society.
Yeah, we sure do live in a society. The surveillance that everyone is constantly being monitored, and down to their brain function can be halted and stuff like that by the people who are watching them. And as Hugo already said, complete systemic automation, that there's not really any humans involved in anything. Another theme I noticed is more of a visual theme of the movie, and that's minimalism, which is an aesthetic that some people really like. I actually really like a minimalistic look for rooms and things like that. I think it's very pleasant. But in this movie, I think it's more than just the aesthetic. It's also a visual metaphor that Hugo has referenced earlier about it being a very aseptic universe. It's clean, it's pristine, but it's also in a very oppressive way. It's being held to this, perceived perfection of it all being so clean, and that actually is to the detriment of the society. Did you guys have any thoughts on any of those that you wanted to add?
Well, for the visual thing, I think it's really funny to me looking back, but maybe in the 70s it made more sense. But if you watch the short film Bald, which is about the making of this movie, Francis Ford Coppola is talking to George, and he's just like, so what are you going to do to show that this is some oppressive future society? He's like, we're going to shave everyone's heads. And then the rest of the movie is just them talking about why them shaving everyone's head is this big, bold choice. And they shave Robert Duvall's head while he's watching a baseball game. And they show all the female actors that are in this film crying because they're shaving off all of their hair. And I was just like, this is such a weird thing to focus on, as this is our bold take on the futures. Everyone's bald.
That's how Kubrick opens Full Metal Jacket. He probably took it back from that documentary. Yeah.
Well,
it's just funny to me.
I can kind of see it in the sense that it's removing individuality. Hair is a way that people distinguish themselves from each other.
Which is why Kubrick opens Full Metal Jacket with that scene of them getting their heads shaved. Yeah.
So, it makes sense, but it is weird to think of it that this was a bold statement, like a crazy idea. When I see it, I'm like, yeah, of course. They're all supposed to be the same.
In the 70s, and particularly maybe in the circles that these people would be frequent, like Coppola and Lucas and Spielberg, these kind of people, they all had really long, the idea of being completely shaven was very authoritarian in some ways. Having long hair in the 70s was kind of a rebel culture. So I can see how to them it was maybe a bigger deal than it is for us now. But yeah.
Some of the other themes that I want to dive into is on the loss of individuality or humanity, which is part of this. The head shaving falls into that. It's human emotion under the constant control with the mind-numbing drugs that I think it's a commentary on oppressive governments, oppressive like power structures, things like that, and people being forced into conforming to a particular box. Which it's not a subtle metaphor by any means in this movie.
Plus they equate human worth to the amount of dollars that they can produce. Because there's even that line in the film where it's like, basic economics says once a person loses the value of their worth by 10%, they are to be exterminated.
Yeah.
Destroyed. They talk about people as them being destroyed, like they break a part of the machine, because it's not used anymore. And even in the monetary value, even in the chase, that like they assign a budget, how much worth does this person have, and once we go over that budget, we're not even going to chase him anymore, and if they get out, they'll get out. It doesn't even matter.
Which does seem like if word got out and people were off their meds and were wanting to break out of society, it'd be really easy to not get arrested by just blowing up a bunch of stuff so that it's too expensive. Let them go. But more importantly, I think, are some of the messages that are not throughout the entire movie, but they have moments that are very stark. Hugo, you wanted to bring up race in this universe.
I think there's one black character in the movie. We see two black people, but there's one black character in the movie. And he shows up at one point, and Donald Pleasant looks at him completely bewildered of this person being so different. And I think the movie is almost implying that the black people are being kept separate and filmed as holograms for these minstrel shows that then, the other members of the society are consuming. We see at one point Robert Duvall's character watching this naked black woman hologram dancing, and there's this machine that is masturbating him, which is a wild visual idea. But like it's not overt, but it's almost as if like Lucas is kind of putting a theme of race and racism in there. He certainly associates whiteness, like the color white, with authoritarianism, very obviously in this, but obviously
in Star Wars as well.
In Star Wars as well. So, like, I'm not entirely sure if it's intentional or not, but that's kind of something that I got out of it.
And as soon as I saw the notes, I was like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And it is a very interesting thing that it's really only a focus at the beginning of the movie there until they run into SRT, which is the hologram that he meets in the White Void prison.
And he calls himself a hologram, but
right,
he obviously isn't.
Emphasizing how the actors in these shows have been dehumanized to the point that they don't even recognize themselves as human. So I thought that was actually one of the more powerful metaphors in this movie. One thing that I thought was interesting, and I know that Hugo already thinks this is a weird take in the first place, but I wanted to talk about it because it stood out to me that for the majority of the movie, we have all these characters attempting to stop or control our central characters, but none of them actually seem to answer to anyone of particular authority. And now it's not explained how this world came to be where it is, but it kind of struck me as sort of a willful subjugation that all of the society agreed to live in these terms, and that there's no actual authority over them, but they've essentially...
There's no big brother.
No big brother, but they've created their own authority structure to keep themselves down. Does that make sense to you guys?
It's interesting that we don't see the central authority figure. I assume there is one, because otherwise, who's providing all those pills? Who decided to do? Someone had to decide to make this kind of world, but you don't really know you're in a totalitarian state because you're kind of numb to it. Is kind of I guess the point that and once you wake up to it, you're like, oh shit, things suck. We need to get out of here.
Well, so what I was kind of thinking was it's either that there is a totalitarian structure here, and that they aren't aware that they've been living in this sort of oppressed society because they don't know what freedom is, or was it that some extenuating circumstance resulted in them saying, okay, we need to be held in check, so they have created this structure for themselves as a society, and there is no actual authority. There's a man behind the curtain sort of thing, with the religious figure that it's not clear that he's an actual person of any kind. But the thing that I noticed was that we see them building androids, and the only androids that we see in the movie are the police force that lord over them. So they're literally building their own oppressors, which that's why it kind of struck me as sort of a willful subjugation situation, that they brought this upon themselves and they perpetuate it themselves. But it's unclear if that's an actual intent or just something that I was picking out. That's why I wanted to ask you guys about it.
Like, for me, as I said before, it almost feels like this is post-dystopia. Like, because a lot of dystopian narratives will have, like, will usually have, like, an older character who remembers a time before the dystopian system has been put into place. And so,
like The Giver.
Yeah, and that is often like sort of the thrust for, rebellion or somebody waking up to what the situation is and that kind of stuff. And in this one, it almost feels, as I said, like it's completely automated, like as if this society was set up a long time ago. And even the oldest characters don't really remember what it was before. And it kind of perpetuated itself because nobody knows any better. I don't know if that's the intention, but I like that it's ambiguous.
I think that's more what I'm thinking. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so moving on to the next part that we wanted to talk about here was a lot, and we'll kind of lump some of this stuff together, is the depiction of violence and sex and religion. Kind of all, there's a lot of criticism in those themes shown in the movie. How the holograms, all of the hologram shows are either people getting beat up or sex. Like that's what the holograms are. Which I think is a commentary on, media, certainly in the 70s, but it definitely only continued through to today, where so much of our media is just violence and sex. This is obviously boiled down to its purest form, which I thought was interesting. But more importantly is the movie's criticism of sex as, in this world, sex is a crime. And, that's, I think, is in a world where totalitarianism is the norm. It's the only thing. That is something that they would do, is they would remove your ability to do that because it's such a personal and humanizing thing.
And it creates a lot of feelings, creates a lot of passions.
Right.
And, feelings and passions are difficult to control, which is why, it's outlawed.
And so I thought it was sort of a criticism of that puritanical view of sex, where it's like, it's not fun. It's not, it's not something to be enjoyed by the masses. It's a criticism of that. But then in religion in general is another big, there's a lot of criticism in this. Hugo, you had a note here on how Lucas views faith in this movie, or in general.
Yeah, I think this was like, oh, I get it. We're doing the prequel thing. Like it's very much. I don't think the movie is necessarily critical of religion specifically, but it's like the entanglement of faith, religion, organized religion, and government. When sort of the government and the power, the actual temporal power, becomes intertwined with this sort of sacrality and becomes a religion of state. That is where he's very critical of it. And I think, you see it in this very clearly, but it's a similar type of thing that he's trying to do with the Jedi in the prequel, where he's not necessarily criticizing the idea of the Jedi wanting to be a force for good, but the criticism there is like they're too dogmatic, they've become intertwined with government, they wield too much like actual power, and that's their downfall, and that's why they fail. And I think this movie is kind of a through line with that. And it's very interesting because like the prequels are so completely tonally different from this, but in some way that element is exactly the same. I don't know if you feel the same, Will. Obviously, you're the big
No, I
you're
actually
a Star
agree
Wars
with that.
expert.
It's just weird to me because, like, George clearly has something he wants to say about organized religion and how powerful it is, but I don't think he's found the effective way of telling it. And he just shows that even more because he reuses it 40 years later. So, I mean, I think he's trying really hard to have something to say without saying it too obviously, but he just hasn't figured it out yet.
And it's like, and the sex thing that you mentioned, Grizz, is another thing that is interesting because famously there's this thing with the Jedi as well that they're not supposed to have, attachment and personal love and relationships. And I'm never clear exactly if the intention is to say, yes, they have this rule, but that rule is wrong, or if the rule is correct, but it's just like
it's only correct if everyone follows it.
Is only like there's something there, and I kind of agree with Will that it's not entirely clear what he's trying to say with this idea of dogma and the relationship between that and how it deals with sex and passion. I think it's not entirely clear where he's going, but it's certainly a through line of his work.
Well, I'd like to move on to the narrative here, and since the narrative is by far the weakest aspect of the movie, we're not going to...
We kind of talked about it, though.
Well, and so I just wanted to look at just a couple of the questions that we have from this movie. Josh asks, what are the stakes in the movie? And, I mean, there's and Hugo, in your notes, you said there's almost none.
I think the stake in the movie is the metaphorical idea of getting out of the system of control. But when you look at it as like a narrative where you want to like kind of identify yourself with the feelings of a character, that there isn't much in terms of stakes emotionally. Because I think the stakes emotionally would be figuring out a way to find this woman that you're in love with, but that kind of gets cast aside in the second half of the movie.
Well, and so that brings me to one of my questions, and I guess it's kind of shared with one of Josh's. Is Josh asks, why did La stop taking her medication in the first place? And that brings me to my question, which was, it's shown that they're in love, but how on earth did they find out they were in love? If he was on medication the whole time, and love is an issue that I think George Lucas has discussing. Every time it comes up in movies, it's kind of weird.
What do you mean? When you're in love, you just look at the other person in the eye and you say, "I truly, deeply love you," and then you go get killed in a coliseum. That's
La or LUH, whatever. His roommate stops taking her pills, so she starts like feeling feelings, and then she stops. She basically gives her THX placebos, I guess, so that he's basically also stopped taking his pills. So I don't think she's like assumes he's in love with her so much as she wants to see what happens. She wants him to experience what she's experiencing, which is feelings.
Yeah.
And then it just so happens that once they both start feeling feelings, they bone,
But like if you've never felt anything your whole life and suddenly you're open to feelings for the first time ever, the first person you meet, you're just instantly going to be extremely taken.
Yeah, assume that you're in love. I guess I can see that.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Like I don't have the same complaint that Grizz does, which is how they fall in love. It's they're feeling feelings for the first time, so that kind of makes sense. But like, I don't know how or why La stopped taking her pills, and I'm not sure if that was covered. I just missed it.
No,
I didn't see it.
Okay,
and so that's one of those moments where I was like, that's like one of the early moments of the movie where you realize, okay, the narrative is not going to be the most important part of this movie.
Yeah.
Which,
and like I said off mic before we start recording, the first like half hour of this movie is a montage. Like there's no scene that's longer than like 20 or 30 seconds. It's like, hard to grab onto anything there.
And so the plot is very, very thin, and so like it is almost like we probably should have just watched the short. And may have gotten the exact same impact out of it. But there is one big highlight of the movie, and that is, for me, the visuals and the practical effects and props. It was pointed out to me before we started recording by Will that I had watched the director's cut version of this movie, which was not stated on HBO Max that it's the director's cut. But there were things that I saw in this movie that, like, you know, I thought, oh wow, that holds up remarkably well. But it turns out those were CG add-ons from 2004.
And like, maybe it's because I knew that that was the case, but every time we cut back to CG, I was like, oh, okay, we're doing this now. Like, there's big mutant CGI monkeys. There's a giant CGI like lobster type bug, and it's extremely red. Like the whole movie is almost black and white because it's so grey and white and dark, and then there's this very red bug type thing that shows up in one scene, and it was always kind of jarring. But it's like, that's George Lucas. Like, it's, but I don't know. I still find it endearing in some ways.
One of the things that did stand out to me was the practical things, like a lot of the vehicles and machinery that they built for this. Like the car, you know, before there's moments in the car chase, as Hugo will point out later, that are very wonky CG, but the parts that it's very clear that it's practical, the cars look cool and futuristic, and you can see like the bones of what becomes vehicle design in Star Wars. Now I know that Lucas didn't design the vehicles themselves for Star Wars, but you know, obviously he had approval on what they looked like, and you can kind of see that it fit his aesthetic that he was going for. But the thing that stood out the most overall, I think, in terms of visuals, is the White Void prison, which I just wanted to talk a little bit about that, because one thing I thought about while I was seeing it was that it is very much there's nothing in the room, right? It's just a big white box. And so part of me thought, okay, is this purely an attempt at showing you the oppressive aesthetic, or how much of this is saving some money on the budget because we don't have to decorate it? Because it's just...
It's a bit of both, isn't it?
Yeah, probably a little bit of both.
Because I like to think that
limitations create good ideas. So.
That's what I'm hoping it was, is because a lot of times, you know, I think that I want directors to make decisions like that purely for their narrative purposes, or the world they're trying to create. But I am also aware this is a business, and and so I was curious about how much of the White Void, which is a surprisingly large chunk of the movie, was, you know, cost cutting measures. But what do you make of that whole scene? Everything that takes place in the White Void. What do you guys think about that, Hugo?
I think the White Void is the most probably striking visual idea of the film, and the fact that it goes on for so long. It's so weird and almost esoteric. The actual scene in the White Void, there's like a 5 to 10 minute sequence where we're just like looking at these crazy people, I guess, or they've been tortured so much that they've kind of lost their minds. I felt it felt almost a little disconnected from the rest of it, but at the same time, there's something interesting there, because there is this idea that they are the deviants in this society. They're the ones who've been able to sort of, in one way or the other, get off the pills and start feeling again and broke the rules. And what they do with them isn't that they just kill them. They kind of send them in this place and they torture them, and it's like unclear why and what the goal is. And another interesting thing is these police officer androids are always so almost like pleasant. They're always saying, "Oh, just friendly. Come back with us." Well, they're friendly. We'll, you know, everything will be okay. Like, they're very soft in their tone, and it's like it creates this weird mood and of conflicting like tones that I find fascinating. Even though, again, I don't know exactly what it's trying to go for, but I think there's something there.
So for me, that was another example of the, you know, willful subjugation theory that I have here. That you know, they make their androids so pleasant because, you know, they're your oppressors, right? But they made them that way. But they're the ones that control. They police society. And then when you look at the White Void sequence, they decide they're going to go try to escape, and so they walk around for several minutes, and they're, you know, Donald Pleasance and Robert Duvall are lost in the void until they just happen to run into SRT, the hologram who's being held there, and he tells them, you know, they say, "Oh, do you know how to get out of here?" And he's like, "Yeah," and they're like, "What?"
This way.
And he's like, "Yeah, it's right there." and then they just walk over there and they walk and like they go to the door. There's no guard stationed. They just kind of walk out. Okay, I guess we're going. And so that's why that's another moment where I was thinking about like this is something that they've constructed for themselves. It's their own prison that they put themselves in, and that's why there's no real security. There's nothing actually keeping them there except them not trying it.
The will to get out of the system. Yeah.
Okay, Will, what do you think about the White Void prison?
Well, I mean, visually, I think it's a cool, interesting idea, and if I had to guess, in the context of this film in the 70s, I think the prison is supposed to represent, to go with the themes of the movie, limbo. Where they're kind of... But to me, if I want to tie it to Star Wars, this is THX's Duel of the Fate. He can either accept his prison sentence and be with these crazy people, or he can make his own fate and escape it. Because he really doesn't care about escaping until he's in the prison. And then all of a sudden he's like, all right, well, I'm going to just get out of here now. Because Donald Pleasance's character kind of references how he had this big master plan to get out of it, because he is kind of the hacker from behind the scenes. But I feel like he chickens out at the end. And it's like, I don't want to escape anymore. I just want to go back to what I was doing. I just want to follow the orders and be from there. But then THX is like, nah, I committed. I'm just going to leave. So I think in a way it's just like him reusing Duel of the Fates again, where it's the fate of this character. Like, which path is he going to pick? And he picks escape.
And so that escape brings us to the end of the movie, which is literally like the entire third act is like half of the movie.
Well, the third act is a chase sequence.
Yeah.
That's the third act, yeah.
But like the chase begins with them going out the door of the white prison, and then now they're on the run, right? So
I think it's about that. There's about half an hour left when that happens.
Oh, really? God, it felt like a lot longer.
I think so. I know, I agree.
It's because they really make a long time of them just getting to that hatch.
Yeah, so THX
the
and
best
SRT
thing is how they're not running for most of it. Like sometimes there's a few scenes where they're just kind of jogging, and the guards are kind of jogging behind them, but not very fast.
Yeah.
THX and SRT have been on the run for a bit, and THX has discovered Le has been consumed, and her name designation, I guess I should put a spoiler warning on this part, but spoilers. She's been consumed and is now, and her designation has been passed on to their child, which, whatever. Honestly, I felt like that was supposed to be a big emotional moment. I felt nothing.
Yeah. I don't get invested in their relationship at all. Like, shocking. He didn't make an on-screen romance worth investing into.
So THX and SRT decide they're going to steal 2 cars and go on the run. And this moment was just weirdly comical to me because SRT immediately slams into a concrete pillar.
Yeah.
Like, right away.
Yeah. But I think again, I think what he's going for, and maybe I'm being too generous, is the black characters are being kept in a state of society where they're not explained any of the technology, because he mentions, I don't know how to use any of this. None of this makes any sense. So maybe like he gets into this car and he barely has any idea what the car is. And so he crashes into a wall. But again, I'm kind of reading into it a lot. But it is funny.
Honestly, I think it was that George wanted THX to be the only one who gets out, so we have to get rid of SRT. Boom, he slams into a pillar. We're done.
Sure.
So then THX is driving away, and now because of the car exploding, all the attention's on him. So he makes his way through a largely deserted tunnel, avoiding the robotic cops chasing him, destroying barriers and barricades, and causing some of the androids to fall from their bikes in pursuit. And then he gets out of the car after he slams it into something and spins out. He gets out of the car and continues down a side tunnel where he sees a shell dweller. This is the CGI monkeys that look pretty wonky. But he sees the shell dweller and he's like, okay, the exit's close, so he continues on. Climbs a ladder with the android cop politely telling him, "Oh, hey, come on back, bud. Like, if you go any further, we can't save you anymore. You got to come back here, dude." But he continues onward, and the android is told, "You have to stop your pursuit because you've gone over budget. We've gone over budget." So now he just gets to go. He's offered that one last chance to come back, and then he decides to push on to the exit, coming out onto the surface of the Earth. Oh my, the city's been underground the whole time. And there's just a bright sun in the sky, and we see that there's like birds flying in the air, which, leaves you with some questions here at the end of the movie of, okay, what happened to the world? Why are they here? And of course, you get answers to none of those.
Where's the second sun?
Where's the second sun?
That's in a galaxy far, far away.
So what do you guys think of this ending? And the question in particular I want to ask is this an optimistic end to the movie or a pessimistic end to the movie? Because that's I think the most poignant question regarding how this movie ends. Hugo, you go ahead.
It's I don't know. I'm not sure. Like it's good for him that he got out. I think. Like, although he's probably alone in a desolate world. What's he gonna do? Like, I don't know. I feel like in some ways and it's something that I do like in movies when the filmmakers have told the part of the story they're interested in, and then the movie ends, and I'm okay with that. Even if we don't get answers to what is going to happen. It's questionable whether it's pessimistic or optimistic, but
and that's kind of where I come down on it as well. I can see it being optimistic if you look at it and you get like, okay, there's some life out here in the world, sure. So maybe the world's not as dead and desolate as we assumed it was. So maybe he can survive. Maybe there are other people out there already, because who knows? Maybe the budget was too much to catch somebody else in the past, so they let him go too. There could be a whole society on the Earth. That's the optimistic view. The pessimistic view is that he came out and is going to die anyways, because that's there's a reason they're underground. Or it's pessimistic in that this whole society is down there, and all they have to do is climb, and they'll have freedom. And there's some pessimism in that none of them are going to. So I come down like right in the middle. Like, I can see it either way. Josh?
Real quick, the English department at my high school has a long running debate about like when they teach comic versus ironic, and basically optimistic endings versus pessimistic endings. We read a short story called "In the AMP" by John Updike, and it's basically a guy who works at a grocery store that quits his job to go to the beach at the end of the story. And like, is it optimistic because he's freeing himself of these restraints to go be free, or is it pessimistic because, well, you're still effed because you still got to make money, and like you're still a prisoner in a different kind of way. Now you just don't have a job. And so I guess, you can read it both ways. But I think the framing of the movie is certainly optimistic, just given like the bright color that we hadn't seen at all throughout the whole movie. And like you said, Chris, the fact that he does just kind of walk out of the white void and he just climbs out of here. Like, I think there's, yeah, you're right. It can be read multiple ways, but I think the movie is telling us it's optimistic, I think.
And Will, what do you think?
Yeah, I read it more as optimistic because he's just like free from this, but like also like I don't know where he would go. Like, we don't know the status of the world, but like he's at least free from where he was. Isn't this how Portal ends? I've never played that game.
It is.
Isn't it
yes.
the same? Yeah, isn't it the same thing where you escape that world?
I think this is how Portal 2 ends.
One of them, I can't remember.
I'm not sure.
So,
but it is
how
pretty
do you
much, yes.
How do you read the ending of that Portal game? That's the same reading here.
But I guess if we want to assume that sunsets in George Lucas stuff mean, there's still hope for the future. That's usually how he uses that.
And that's
visual,
true. Basically, in every movie that we see a sunset, there's a hope for the future there. So.
Like even American Graffiti, I think, ends with dawn. So that there's this
with the
visual
sunset.
motif that he
sunrise.
likes.
Yeah, sunrise. Yeah.
So I think most of the articles I read about this movie tended to come down on the side of it's supposed to be optimistic, which some people thought was tonally incorrect for what the rest of the movie was. But I don't know. You guys know how I like optimistic things. So
I think it's okay. I think it's optimistic for him, but it's still, most of humanity is still subjugated.
right,
So
which is the way the world is today.
it is.
Happy
Yeah.
note to end our discussion on.
Great.
So now we're at the point to rank the movie on our Film to Remember ranking list. So I'll just go ahead and kick it off. I put this movie at number 40 behind Trial of the Chicago 7, which is a movie that we all know that I admittedly like much more than the average person. So certainly the average person on this podcast.
Certainly me. Yeah.
And so on that note, Hugo, where do you put it?
It's interesting because I feel like I'm more positive on the movie than all of us overall. But I have a hard time putting it on the list just because I just can't put it above The Matrix Reloaded for me. Will knows this as well, how much I love The Matrix. So, and it's kind of like, again, weird that this movie kind of in some when I saw the black guy in the white void, I was like, oh, it's Morpheus in The Construct. There he is. That's the immediate thing that I thought of. So I would put it 2 spots further down, I guess, at 41. But I suspect this will be higher on my personal list when we do a re-rank in 2 weeks.
Coming up quick.
Yep.
Josh, where do you put it?
I think I'd like to put it at number 49, please.
Damn.
Which is in last place.
I had a feeling that was where it was going to go for Josh. Will, I know you're not looking at our list, but just give us some final thoughts on the movie.
I mean, I think the common person will be more aligned with Josh on this movie. I don't think his opinion is as much of an outlier as this podcast episode might make it seem. I think a lot of people won't connect with this, so I can totally get it. Most of my connection is just because I'm so interested in Lucas's filmmaking techniques, and that's what carries it, is his aspect that way. Take all of that away, there's really nothing here, which is why it bombed.
But I do think that ultimately it is a movie worth talking about in terms of, like we said, George Lucas being such a pioneer of the industry in so many different ways, and this being his directorial debut, it's a good thing to look back at. Even if you don't love it, it's worth taking a look to kind of see the bones of what becomes THX, ILM, Star Wars, everything that he created.
It's an ambitious debut, that's for sure.
Yeah.
But yeah, so that's going to be it for us this week on Remember the Film.
But we didn't say where it's going to end up on that list.
Oh, yeah, well, so
if we
sorry.
average out, yeah.
Averaging out our places on the rankings, it's going to come in at number 44 currently, behind Slither at 43, and above Iron Man 3 at 45. It's a weird list. But yeah, so that's it for this week. So we'll do our usual thing here. We'll start with our guest, Will. Where can people find you on the internet if they want to follow your opinions on movies or other things going on in the world?
I usually dump all those on my Twitter at WO Beamon. If you want to know what kind of tweets I make, my bio pretty much covers it all on there.
And Hugo, where can we find you?
And you can find me at Hugo_Pinay or at Hugo Pinay on Letterboxd.
And Josh?
At the Sloop, Josh B on Twitter. Movies I Love, So Can You on YouTube.
And you can find me on twitch.tv/GoodGameGrizz and Twitter, GoodGameGrizz, and Letterboxd, GoodGameGrizz. And of course, please follow at RTF_pod for information about this podcast. There have been more tweets coming out of it recently, so keep your eyes up for that. And we will see you next time, which we should have my friend Jennifer Van Damsel on to talk about the killing of the sacred deer.
Killing of
a sacred deer. Excuse me. Killing of a sacred deer.
Yeah.
And
Good movie.
If you're not familiar with Jennifer Van Damsel, she's a professional cosplayer and a Twitch streamer and all those good things.
And you'll meet her next week.
So thanks everyone for joining us. We'll see you next time.
All I want to say about it is that it reminds me of that SpongeBob episode where they have a time machine. It's cool. Wrapped up in a white void alone. all alone. 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 Alone.
What's happening?